Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Daniel Bowker. I'm the Forest and Fire Project Manager for the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. CPRW is a local organization dedicated to improving and maintaining the health of the Poudre River Watershed through community collaboration. Welcome to Learning from Burning, Science and Monitoring Outcomes from the Elkhorn Unit 4 Prescribed Fire. This is the first of 3 upcoming opportunities to learn more about the outcomes of the prescribed fire at the Ben Delator Scout Ranch in October of last year. More information on the next 2 opportunities in just a moment. The intention today is to talk about the science of the prescribed fire and its ecological effects, highlighting the outcomes of the fire in the context of its intent. The Elkhorn Unit 4 prescribed fire gives us insight into the effects of putting fire back into a system where it has been excluded for more than a century, but where it functions as a keystone environmental process. If you have more questions about why fire was used as a management tool in this instance, please ask them today. I know that many people have more questions and concerns about the escape and the resulting wildfire. The wildfire was a major disruption for hundreds of affected residents, and those of us who advocated for this use of prescribed fire are incredibly sorry for this disruption and the fear and the concern that it caused. Rob Addington of the Nature Conservancy Colorado chapter will continue the discussion about the escape and the wildfire briefly at the end of the webinar today, along with the adjustments that are being made within the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative for prescribed burning on private lands. While we look forward to continuing that vital conversation with the community, today's webinar is about the science of the fire itself and its ecological effects. We have a great panel of researchers to explain the details. Pardon me a moment while I share my screen. We looking good, Jen? Got the PowerPoint?
Yes, yep.
Very good. Again, welcome to Learning from Burning, Science and Monitoring Outcomes from the Elkhorn Unit 4 Prescribed Fire. Today on our panel, we have Kat Morici, Research Associate with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at CSU, Wade Tinkham, an Assistant Professor of Forest Measurements in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at CSU, Chuck Rhoades, a Research Biogeochemist with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Rob Addington, Landscape Ecologist with the Nature Conservancy Colorado chapter. I mentioned upcoming opportunities to learn more about the Elkhorn Unit 4 Prescribed Fire. We have our webinar today, and then on August 27th at noon, I'll be taking part in Commissioner John Kafalis's Red Feather Lakes Community Conversation, which is currently scheduled to be a virtual meeting. At that, I'll be going through the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control's review of the escape incident and their ensuing report. Then on September 12th, we're working hard to get together a Unit 4 public field tour at the Scout Ranch. This, of course, will follow all county guidelines for safety during the pandemic. More information will be coming out in about a week on details about this event. We'd love to have you out. We also have some other webinars coming up, great educational opportunities during the virtual Poudre River Fest, which is going to be the last week of August. The web address for their schedule is on the screen right now. On August 24th at 2:05, we will rebroadcast our Forest and Fire Management during the COVID-19 pandemic webinar. This was really good. We did it back in June. Love to have you tune in to a rebroadcast of that one. On August 26th at 2:05, we will be rebroadcasting this webinar, Learning from Burning. And then on August 27th at noon, we will have a live webinar titled Flowing for the Future, Native Fish, Resilient Rivers, and Sustainable Agriculture. Love to have you join us for any or all of those great opportunities. Again, this webinar today is being recorded. Just so you know, we will post it up and you'll be able to access this at any point after it is over. Please use the chat function for questions. My colleague at CPRW, Jen Kavexis, is collecting those questions and we'll give them to the panelists after all the presentations are finished today. We'll have plenty of time to answer a lot of good questions from the audience. Keep in mind that the chat function, it says you might be anonymous, but because we are recording this, your anonymity goes away during the recording. So all your comments will be tied to the login address that you use. So let's keep everything respectful. And please help us improve this content by filling out a post-webinar survey that you will receive after we're done. You can reach CPRW in all kinds of ways. There's our web address. You can send us an email. We'd love to have you follow us on Facebook and Instagram. I want to tell you quickly about the context of the Elkhorn Unit 4 prescribed fire. In 2015, 5 entities, the Longs Peak Council, Boy Scouts of America, Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, the Nature Conservancy, Larimer County Conservation Corps, and the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed formed the Elkhorn Creek Forest Health Initiative. The intent of this initiative was to implement forest restoration projects to protect water quality in Elkhorn Creek and hence in the larger Poudre River watershed. As you can see from the map, Elkhorn Creek watershed is a major tributary to the Cashel-Poudre River. Comes into the river right at the Dutch George campground. You might know that pull out there. It's a nice hike. And water quality in Elkhorn Creek is important to water quality in the larger Poudre River, which of course is water supply for over 300,000 people. You also see the outline of the Ben Delator Scout Ranch on the map in black and the outline of the fire in October in red. And so you can see that anything we do to protect water in Elkhorn Creek is going to protect water quality in the river. And we are looking to reduce the effects of high intensity wildfire in that landscape, which has negative effects on water quality. The Elkhorn the Elkhorn Creek Forest Health Initiative since 2015 has received and spent over $1 million in grant funding. We're the lucky recipients of over 3,000 hours of volunteer labor, and we completed over 900 acres of forest restoration treatments on the Ben Delator Scout Ranch on Elkhorn Creek. This includes 169 acres of mechanical thinning with heavy equipment, 53 acres of hand thinning and slash pile burning, chainsaw work, and over 700 acres of broadcast prescribed fire. In 2017, we burned about 120 acres, and this last fire in October 2019 was over 500. We've recently expanded this initiative to nearby landowners to the east along Elkhorn Creek and to the south over on North Rim Road to really increase the landscape scale effectiveness of the work that we're doing in the Elkhorn Creek watershed. The Elkhorn Unit 4 prescribed fire was an integral part of the treatment plan for the Scout Ranch and for the Elkhorn Creek watershed itself. The particular objectives of the Elkhorn Unit 4 prescribed fire were: 1, to provide for firefighter and public safety, to reduce fuels, including thatch, shrubs, seedlings and saplings, and to reduce dead fuels to minimize the potential for high severity fire effects, to reintroduce fire as a natural process in the ponderosa pine ecosystem, and to provide training opportunities where appropriate. The actual prescribed fire objectives were to reduce for regeneration, small stems, less than 6 inches in diameter, by at least 20% within 1 year of the burn, to reduce fuels on the ground by 30% immediately after the burn, to limit the mortality of larger diameter canopy trees to 20% or less, and to increase native herb cover by 20% within 2 years of the burn. On the 2 days of the fire, there were 50 personnel representing over 12 agencies and organizations. 385 acres was burned successfully on Tuesday, October 15th, and the goal was for another 120 acres to be burned on Wednesday, October 16th. As most of us know, the fire escaped the unit lines around 3 p.m. on Wednesday the 16th. Operations immediately switched to containment of that escape, and there was a wildfire declaration at 3:59 p.m. The fire was 100% contained by 8 a.m. on Friday, October 18th. And once again, I'd like to thank all of the wildland firefighters who were able to be on site and get that fire quickly contained. So with that brief introduction to the Elkhorn Creek Initiative and the work that we're trying to do out there and how Elkhorn Unit 4 prescribed fire fits into that context, I'd like to hand it over to Captain Morici with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute to start talking about the fire effects.
Great. I will also share my screen here. Thanks for that intro. Yeah, again, my name is Kat Morici, and at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, we have a network of monitoring plots in forest treatments across Colorado. A lot of the treatments are mechanical, and we're making a concerted effort to get more monitoring into prescribed fire areas like this one. So this was a good opportunity for us. We installed plots in Elkhorn 4, measured them pre-treatment and then immediately post-fire. And those are the results that I'm going to present today. So just reiterating, the management goals were firefighter and public safety, managing fuels there, and reintroducing fires in natural process, as well as training opportunities where appropriate. Data collection, we had two styles of plots in this unit. One is the simple plot, which is a picture that's on the upper right. And the main goal of the simple plot is to measure the forest, like get a good survey of the trees and the woody fuels and shrubs, and just kind of a vague idea of the understory. So really focused on the main, fuels that a fire would burn. And then in the lower right there is a mothership plot, which we go into, we do a complete species survey in a 1/10 acre plot. So that we can actually look at species diversity and abundance, use a line point intercept method for that. So post-fire, our data collection consisted of photos, substrate burn severity. Substrate is just the forest floor. Litter and duff depths, fine woody fuel loading, and then trees and saplings, we kind of assessed fire effects on those. So it's really targeted towards things that could change. We try to get in there like 1 to 2 months post-fire before the red needles start to drop, so we can characterize the fire effects. And then we do a complete remeasurement of all the plots 1 year post-treatment, which we just wrapped up last month, but those data are not analyzed yet, so that'll be forthcoming. Here's a map of the unit with our plots distributed across it. So in that north unit, we have 30 simple plots. They're randomly placed across the unit, although we did require there to be at least 1 tree per plot so we could measure some of the fire effects on trees, which is something we're really looking to get a better idea of how that's operating in Colorado. In the southern unit, we have 9 mothership plots. So one of the key things we look at is how much of the area burned. In the southern unit, I said there were 9 plots, 5 of those burned, which is 56%. However, as Daniel mentioned also, that was where the escape took place. So ignition was stopped at that point, and didn't really allow all the plots, so not all the plots were ignited. In the north unit, the whole unit was burned. However, only 25 of the 30 plots, I say burned as in it experienced some fire. There was some evidence of fire within that plot area. And that's 83% of those plots burned. So the percent substrate burned within burn plots, that last column there, that's referring to about how much of the plot area burned within the plots that experienced some fire. And as you can see, this fire really was not it was sort of patchy. We had about 75% or so of the substrate within the burn plots actually burned. Burn severity. So we categorized how intensely the forest floor burned. This is taken from the Fire Monitoring Handbook. It's the Fire Mon protocols were developed, I believe, by the Park Service. They're used by a lot of federal agencies, and we adopted them as well. I'm going to focus on that top row, which is substrate. So we can categorize that. We take like a 10 by 10 centimeter square and place it at various points around each plot, and you assign 1 number per little subplot. And you can assign an unburned if it's no evidence of fire within that area, a scorched if it's just the surface is kind of blackened, lightly burned, which is the litter is charred to partially consumed, but not through the entire depth of the litter duff layer, and moderately burned, where that may be mostly consumed there, but the underlying mineral soil is intact, and then heavily burned, which is essentially it burns so hot that the underlying mineral soil is altered, and that's quite rare. It could also be inorganic, like rock, which can't burn. So looking at all of our subplots, the vast majority of them fell into the scorched category, or over 50% of them fell into that category. 25% were unburned. And then we had some that were lightly, about 5% were moderately burned. We had no heavily burned areas within our subplots. This is for both the north and the south unit. And when we looked at the change in litter and duff depth, we saw, as you'd expect with a fire, they went down a bit. Also, we looked at litter and duff cover, which I don't have a figure for, but that changed from about 85% to 75%, so it went down by about 10% in cover. Meanwhile, soil and gravel cover went up by about 10%. That's fairly, it's an interesting metric because with some of the large severe wildfires we've had in Colorado, when you completely lose your litter and duff layer and all you have is soil and gravel, and you get heavy rain events, that can lead to a lot of erosion issues. So definitely would not expect that here, given the pretty minimal change in overall cover. Fine woody fuels are defined as less than 3 inches in diameter. So we're looking at everything from twigs up to kind of small branches. And those are divided up into 1, 10, and 100-hour size classes based on their exact diameters. But overall, the story here is that they didn't change very much. They maybe went down slightly. However, they were fairly low to begin with. So a combined fine woody fuel loading of 1 ton per acre, or less than 1 ton per acre, is considered to be pretty low. So the fact that it didn't change much was, it's interesting, but it was pretty low to begin with. And next, I'm going to talk about trees. So the metrics I'll talk about today are crown volume scorch and initial tree mortality estimate. Crown volume scorch is the percent of the needles on the tree that turned red after the fire. So in the tree that's kind of behind this picture here, you can see about half of those needles are red, so that would be 50% crown volume scorch. So in the south unit, the average crown volume scorch was 24%. And our initial tree mortality estimate there is our estimate of tree mortality when the crown volume scorch is 100. So all of the needles are red or gone. We are pretty sure that tree is going to die. Predicted tree mortality estimate, that column next to it, is taken from a paper that assessed, like, at what point, how will the trees usually die? Because you can assume it might be, less than 100. And what they found is about 85 to 90% was a threshold beyond which most trees die post-fire. And in the north unit, we actually saw greater crown volume scorch. That was 50% crown volume scorch on average, with an initial tree mortality estimate of 22%. That's percent of the total trees in that unit, and predicted 37%. It was interesting to me that it escaped in the south unit, and you can see there's no tree mortality predicted here, which indicates to me that the fire was not a crown fire. It was not being carried by the trees at that point at the escape, which I believe has been verified by the people on the ground. But yeah, just an interesting point with the data. We also looked at saplings. Saplings are at least 4.5 feet tall and less than 5 inches in diameter at that height. There were no saplings that we measured in the south unit because regeneration can be a little bit patchy. The trees it's a fairly open grassy area. There are some areas that don't have small trees. In the north unit, we had 3 saplings measured across all 30 plots, and all of them were predicted to die. That was actually one of the goals of the project, which I'll just put that back up here. The bird plan objectives did include reducing conifer regeneration here by at least 20% within 1 year of the burn, reducing 110 and 100-hour fuels by 30% immediately post-burn. From my calculations, that number turned out to be more like between 5 to 15% of a reduction, but again, it was fairly low to begin with. Limiting mortality of trees greater than 10 inches to 20% or less. This is something that I'm going to assess with our most recent round of data collection. And same thing with that last bullet point, the increasing native herbaceous vegetation by 20% within 2 years of the burn. So those are going to be answered more with our upcoming data collection. I also wanted to point out one thing I missed about crown volume scorch, and that's a unique effect that fire has here. When you have, 25 to 50% crown volume scorch, that's mostly the lower needles that are getting burned. And after they turn red and fall off, the fire then has farther to go to jump up into the tree crowns. So it's raising that crown base height. We have a lot of monitoring in mechanical treatments around Colorado, and very few mechanical treatments affect crown base height here. Whereas prescribed fire, we are seeing a much bigger effect, which does factor into how resilient a stand will be, resistant to crown fire. That is my presentation. I'd like to thank the Peaks of People Water Fund providing funding to do this kind of monitoring. I think it's extremely valuable. Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed for putting this on, and also the Nature Conservancy. And yep, I will stop sharing. I think if you have questions, just write them down and we'll get to that at the end.
Great, thank you very much, Kat. Really appreciate that. Those are some interesting results. And we're going to switch now to Wade Tinkham, forest measurements professor at CSU, and this will build on what Kat was telling us using some of Wade's drone imagery and analysis that he collected pre and post burn.
All right. So as Daniel was saying, we kind of had a unique opportunity to get out and play with some of our research toys. And so in the weeks leading up to this, we were able to get out, I want to say it was about a week before the burn and about 3 weeks after the burn, and do some data collection with our drone units. And I just want to do a shout out to two of my graduate students that without them, I couldn't make any of this happen, Neil Swayze and Matt Creasy. Two of them worked themselves to the bone to out flying these drones, getting this data collected and help me process it all. So just some background, some past research we've done in a laboratory setting basically allows us to really strongly correlate the amount of energy these trees are experiencing to the amount of physiological effect it's having on the trees themselves. So what the actual physical response is and the probability of them actually seeing death into the future. And so this is some work we did at the Idaho Fire Research Laboratory about 4 or 5 years ago now, just looking at how we had 2 different species in this one where we're just looking at how these plants are going to respond, but also how does that correlate to what our remote sensing sensors are able to see, so what the drone itself is able to see from the plant. And we get these really strong relationships as the tree experiences more energy that relates well to what the drone's able to see. So we flew about 125 acre area to the southwest area of the prescribed burn. So we got pre and post imagery. So this is just standard color red, green, blue imagery that we have. This took about an hour and a half to collect all of the data that we have for the pre-flight and about an hour and a half to collect all of the data for the post-flight. We also collected 5-band multispectral data because this gives us a little more definition where we can start looking at the actual effects of how light is interacting with this vegetation and how we can use that to describe things. So this is about an 8-centimeter resolution imagery that we collect, flying at about 120 meters in altitude out there. And so we can start to see direct effects that we're having on these plants where we can see there's entire trees that are more or less missing within the imagery now. We can see some trees that are changing in their coloration within the imagery, whereas we have some other trees that have almost no effect in the imagery. And so we're going to be looking at those differences and trying to tease out what that means through this data. What we do is we take that pre and post burn data and we calculated what's called a delta normalized difference vegetation index. Is basically how green am I versus how red am I? And we're looking at how that changed in the pre and post fire imagery to try and make an assessment of similar things like Kat was doing with the scorch in these crowns. How much red needle is there versus how much green needle there was before the fire. And so if I pull your eye to a couple of spots in here, we can see in the pre-fire imagery, trees look nice and bright. That means they're really green. They have a lot of moisture in their foliage. Post-fire imagery, a little duller, but not much. The only thing we really see is this little coloration on the edge of this crown. that corresponds to this orange strip at the lower edge of this tree in the NDVI indice. To pull your eye to one other spot in here, we have a group of about 5 trees here. Post-fire, it's basically 3 trees or less. 2 of these were junipers in the site that are much more highly susceptible to the fire transitioning into their crowns to begin with. And if we look at what that means in the NDVI, those 2 trees would be these locations that see a lot of change, meaning they saw a higher effect from the fire to their vegetation. And we see some coloration to the edges, where we're seeing these light colors to these trees. That's because we're seeing scorch within these trees on the lower branches on the outer edge of these trees. So raising that crown like Kat was talking about. So overall, if we play some fun eye candy, between the 4 data sets we collected, it's across all of it, it's something like 7 billion data points that we collected on the 125 acres. So it's a kind of god-awful amount of data that we acquire through this. But we're able to take the multiple images we take and get these different view angles. And using a process called structure for motion, we can create 3-dimensional profiles of the vegetation itself. So this is just taking using normal imagery, but then stitching it all together with different angles. We can create profiles of what the vegetation height looks like in these locations. And then we can tie that imagery and the spectral response to those plants at the same time. So we have quite a bit of data. We're mostly analyzing just this lower data, just because it gives us a little more definition of how the vegetation is directly responding, having those 5 spectral bands down here, whereas these are the red, green, blue 3-band imagery, just normal color imagery. If I get to my next slide, maybe. There we go. With that 3-dimensional data, we create what's called a canopy height model, which is just how tall is the vegetation. So that's what this layer is just how tall is the vegetation at any given location. And we run this algorithm across it that allows us to extract the local maximum or find individual tree crowns effectively. So we pass this circle across there that it finds this location, and then it follows up with how can I delineate this crown itself. So we get the location of the tree, the height of the tree, and the area that crown occupies for the tree. With that, then we can merge that with that spectral information and pull out how is this tree spectrally changing through the fire. And so we're able to use this polygon that's created to extract exactly what's going on for this individual tree at this location. So we can see pre and post, we can start looking at how is this tree changing into the fire itself. So if we look at what we wound up pulling out, we pulled out just under 3,000 trees across that 125 acres, or about 23 trees to the acre throughout that area. This is how it breaks out in terms of just doing some rough classification of burn severity on them. So we're saying about 6% of the trees saw no spectral change. So we're saying they didn't experience fire interacting with their crown at all. About 14% saw some kind of low level change, which means they changed less than 20% in their spectral signature. But 22% of all trees across the site saw a high change, which means they saw greater than an 80% change in their spectral signature within what's going on at the site. And we can kind of see the distribution of tree sizes across the entire site, where we have this larger regeneration pulse, which was part of the target for managing these sites. And then we have these larger trees that are more sparsely spread across the site. So I pull you just to think about this high severity component of what's going on within these sites. This high severity component highly correlates the height of these trees, where at the shortest end of the distribution of tree sizes, we're affecting somewhere around 33% of trees, tapering off to negligibly anything at the upper end of this distribution. And so within these smaller tree classes, we're hitting about 31% of trees under 5 meters tall within this site, which should roughly correspond to somewhere around that 6-inch diameter class limit. We can play with that number a little, but somewhere in that 30 to 33% range. above that 6-meter class, we're hitting somewhere around 16% of trees are experiencing this higher severity level. I can't directly say from this data, with the way we've set it up right now, if these trees will die or not. That would take us doing one extra step in the analysis that we just aren't set up to do yet with the data. But gives us an inkling of where these trees might be headed at some point. And generally, the other severity classes were just flat. Just a uniform distribution of all of the other severity classes. This would be basically a flat line at different levels, where a lot of trees saw a moderate severity level, which would correlate to what Kat was saying with that 30 or 50% scorch, lifting that crown in those trees through a lot of these trees, where it's about half the trees in population saw that scorching happening that should be lifting those crowns. And then we have a small component of, say, 20% of the trees that saw negligible effects from the fire itself across the entire site. So that's kind of what I prepared. We also, with this, can capture some fun and pretty video footage. So this is just kind of 4 chunks of video that I stitched together that kind of just wrap around this rock in a few different vantage points, the large rocky outcropping that's out there. And so we can see the patchy nature of the fire that Kat was talking about, looking at this in different areas, where we have some areas that we had much more consistent fire consumption, whereas we get other areas where we had much more sporadic fire consumption within that understory. We can also see areas where we had pockets of trees being taken out, which is one of those things we aim for in these restoration style burns. We also get individual trees that are being consumed within this footage. So we can see the variability within the nature of how this fire plays on this landscape, which also makes it a fun thing to manage out there. So kind of the last thing I have, just kind of showing how patchy and variable things are across the landscape out there. So now it's not a consistent result anywhere, and that's why maybe Kat's results and my results, they support each other, but they're not identical. Having her sampling within this patchy landscape just makes it hard sometimes to capture it completely. So.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Wade. So this is interesting. I think, with both of those data sets together, you're really seeing, like you said, some of the patchiness. Some of that was the goal. Our forests over the past 100 years with fire exclusion have become more homogeneous, and we've lost some of that variability on the landscape. So it really seems like from both of your data sets that we've recovered some of that variability and some of that heterogeneity across the landscape with fire. Great stuff. Thank you both. We're going to change gears now and get into some water quality effects. Mentioned earlier that the reason, one of the main reasons that we do this forest restoration work is to protect water quality. High severity wildfire, like we saw in the High Park fire, leads to hill slope failures and nutrient inputs and all kinds of things like that. A unique aspect of this prescribed fire was that we have water quality data on some of these tributaries, both before and after the fire. And Chuck Rhoades, biogeochemist at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, is going to speak to some of these water quality effects. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you very much. Those were really great presentations, and I learned a lot from them both, and especially Wade's has me thinking about a lot of tree level burn severity versus sort of broader watershed scale things. So hopefully I've learned something already. This is a great group to be part of, and I'd like to sort of start off by thinking a little bit about why are we actually interested in water quality, and Daniel outlined that. I mean, that's one of the main objectives of these prescribed burns. We're trying to avoid the damaging negative effects of another High Park fire, another Hayman fire, the big concerns that treatment plants have, that downstream water users have. it's also quite important for aquatic ecosystems, what's going on with nutrient enrichment, and what does that mean for our fisheries and our stream habitats and our recreationists. Our rivers are highly used by ourselves and our neighbors. Another aspect of this that is often not really considered, when we have nutrients or we have water quality concerns, that's also linked to what's going on up in the upland. So nutrients that end up in a stream came from somewhere, and those prior to the fire were feeding plants up in the landscape. So often that means that you've lost nutrients or carbon from the soils in the upland area, which may take a while to regenerate. So those are sort of a disturbance indicator, and gives us some idea of sort of our restoration goals to get back to a water quality condition prior to a fire. Wildfires come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. We've had a number around the Front Range that have had different sorts of effects on ecosystems and water quality. Many of us on the Front Range are familiar with the Hayman Fire, which happened 18 years ago, and the effects are still very, very vivid on the landscape. It's been very, very slow to regenerate, largely due to the amount of that area that was burned at high severity. High severity varies the way people talk about it. Wade's talking about it on a tree by tree basis. Watershed folks think about it more broadly, and it's the amount of an area, the amount of vegetation in a given area that's lost, and the amount of organic matter or organic covering, Kat was speaking about that's lost. And in other words, how much of that area is exposed to high intensity rains and are at risk of erosion or nutrient losses. So we have these kinds of a range, and you can see in the central picture there, different catchments or different tributaries may be burned to different extents. Some not at all, some to 100% at high severity, and everything in between. When we're creating prescribed burns, we're often trying to shoot for these low severity or moderate severity fires. So one of the important things to realize why we care about this is high severity fires can have long-term serious consequences for water quality for downstream water users. And what we're seeing in this diagram was stream water of a number of tributaries 14 to 15 years following the Hayman Fire. And what you see is that areas and streams that were burned over 50% at high severity, represented by the red columns, had lasting effects in terms of various attributes that influence downstream aquatic ecosystems. So high nitrate, high total dissolved nitrogen. Another point that you should notice is that even moderate fires were having effects on certain analytes. So dissolved organic carbon, the third level, that was having an effect. Those are constituents that can influence water treatment as well as aquatic ecosystems. It's important to see that the responses vary among these different analytes. So sediment was largely back to normal after 14 to 15 years. There's still a bit of an effect, but the recovery of grassy vegetation in these areas represented a more rapid recovery for sediment, whereas things that were leached below surface like nitrogen, those are still responding even more than 18 years following the fire. Okay, but we're here to talk about prescribed fire, and we have a great opportunity to talk about that on the Elkhorn burn and other burns in the area, because in the last few years, the Rocky Mountain Research Station has partnered with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed to set up a citizen science stream water monitoring program to work around some of these prescribed fire activities. So it's interesting that compared to wildfires, there's actually very little known about prescribed fire. We assume that the effects are going to be a lot less, and that makes sense, of course. We would, and we can see obviously from Wade and Kat's results that may be really the case. But before we spread these landscape treatments all over the Front Range, like we would like to do, it would be good to be able to couple that assumption and validate it with some science. So we've been looking at water quality responses to various prescribed fires for the last several years. We'd like to be able to get as much work done as possible. So burn large areas, and have as large an impact on the uplands as possible, but we have to avoid negative effects downstream. So that's kind of what we're shooting for here. So I have some data from the Elkhorn burn, and when you see a picture like the one on the right there, you can see ash moving down following a wildfire. Ash is full of cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium. It's no surprise that when you start to mobilize ash and sediments that you'll see an increase in many different constituents. So on the left-hand side there, we can see the ion concentrations. We measure it as electrical conductivity, calcium and potassium, you know, potash, so it comes out of fire and ash, and we can see that there's a 2 to 3 times increase in those constituents compared to the areas upstream on the Elkhorn or downstream. So the little red ribbon in the picture is the tributary that's coming out of the center of the Elkhorn burn. And so you can see that, in fact, there were responses. We sampled downstream and then all the way down to the confluence with the Poudre. You can see, it's important to realize that we do see a spike in the tributary, but that doesn't permeate downstream. By the time we move down, dilution from the Elkhorn pretty much erases any effect of that fire. Okay, so that's cations. If we look at things that are more commonly concerns for water quality, sediment and nutrients that might influence eutrophication, I have a number of analytes starting with suspended sediment, nitrate, total dissolved nitrogen, and dissolved organic carbon. And the same layout where the orange area is the tributary coming out of the fire. You see a picture of that tributary up close. And the data is showing a whole lot of nothing. So we see perhaps 1 or 2 samples where we have high nitrate, we might see high sediment, but they're not out of the realm of what we see or the range of variability that we see above or below where that tributary comes in. And I think when you look at an area like that tributary in the photo, you see high burn severity effects there. But if you scale it up and you look at it sort of through the lens of what Kat and Wade were talking about, that actually represents a very small area. So if we did some quick back of the envelope calculations on that high burn severity area, and it's less than 1%. So you can recall of the burned polygon, and you recall from the Heyman figures I showed you before, we were looking at big effects from extreme wildfires when they were above 50% of an area. So we're way down below that with this fire. Okay, so if we think about the context of this a little bit more, we're really fortunate to have volunteers out over the last several years running around grabbing samples from sites throughout the Cache-la-Poudre drainage, and so we can take the Elkhorn burn and kind of put it into a broader context thanks to the work of those volunteers. So I've replotted some of the analytes that respond to ash, EC, magnesium, and chloride, and that's in the orange bar. You can see how those are elevated with regards to the above and below tributary Elkhorn data. But the bar on the right is something else going on in the catchment, completely independent of wildfire, and that's what's going on in streams that have been receiving magnesium chloride running off of the Rhoades. So it's an opportunity for us to sort of look at prescribed fire and think about it in the context of what else is going on in those catchments, and relative to the amount of chloride and magnesium coming in, these prescribed burns are doing virtually nothing. And I think that it's good for us to be thinking about, we will alter catchments when we burn them, but are we altering them in ways that's going to be a long-term source of degradation, or is it changing things in ways that's different from other sorts of perturbations in the catchments? So what have we learned from this? This is a great opportunity, and again, we have to thank our volunteers for helping us get this data, this sort of pre-fire data set that prescribed the high severity burning that happened right on top of that stream. You can see some riparian fuels there in the photo. That's where a high density of fuels are. That could be considered a sort of a worst case scenario where you have a high severity right on top of the fire. our data show that that actually wasn't the case, and which is fortunate. We were that area was burned intentionally. It was not part of the escape. It was right up at the edge of the burn unit, and it doesn't seem like it's had negative effects. So this is all very preliminary data. We're just getting started out there. We have yet to sample storm events. We're trying to schedule that as we speak. Some of the effects of prescribed fires and wildfires may take a couple years to sort of develop and move through the system. So we want to trace these things over time. Based on some of the things I've just heard and things that I know from other sites, I'm very interested to see how the vegetation responds, because that will have a big effect on how the watershed responds. So we want to be able to link the vegetation response and then what we see in the stream channel. So thank you very much. This has been a great session. And again, I'd like to thank the numerous volunteers and our friends at the Coalition for Poudre River Watershed for helping us gather all of this data. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chuck. We appreciate that contextualization in terms of water quality. As I said before, that's a lot of the reason that we do this work. So it's really good to have that information on these prescribed fires in the context of the larger fires like Hayman and High Park. Finally, I'm going to hand it over to Rob Addington from the Nature Conservancy. He's a landscape ecologist with the Colorado chapter and has been responsible for a lot of really good scholarship and planning work for forest and fire restoration in the region. And he can tell us a little bit more about Elkhorn Unit 4 and TNC's perspective. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Daniel. And thank you all for joining this afternoon. It's good seeing you all. And I do also want to thank all the presenters, Kat, Chuck, Wade, very valuable information. This is information that's just very important from the standpoint of adaptive management and helping us better understand the effects of these prescribed fires ecologically and how we can, as a prescribed fire community, continue to improve the management practice here. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. And Daniel, again, thanks for allowing me a little bit of time here at the end to cover a few things. One is I do want to just build from the opening comments that you provided, Daniel, around just kind of the acknowledgement of the escape in particular on the community of Glacier View, and just the fact that we've continued, to try to understand what happened with the escape itself, continue to acknowledge the impacts that the escape had on the community, and as Daniel mentioned, are just extremely sorry for creating that impact. So I wanted to start with that, and then I wanted to kind of segue into a couple of updates, one on the Nature Conservancy's fire program, and two on the status of the review and recommendations from the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, which were officially released in March, but wanted to provide kind of an update on where we are with that process. So I'm gonna share my screen here with just a couple of slides. Okay, does that work, Daniel? Can you give me a thumbs up? Great. So the first update that I mentioned on the Nature Conservancy's fire program, we have, like a lot of other agencies and organizations, had some pretty significant impacts related to the financial economic downturn from COVID-19. And as part of that, the organization at the really larger global level has gone through looking at our various strategies and priorities and thinking through ways in which we can narrow our strategies and priorities, and have, as a result of that process, ended up with cuts basically across the board at around a 20% level through the organization. And as part of that, also an analysis of different activities, different programs and strategies that could be transitioned to partner organizations as well. And so TNC's fire program has kind of fallen into this category of one that we feel like we're no longer able to sustain ourselves, but do have good opportunity to transition to our close partner, the Forest Stewards Guild. And so that's what we've been working on really since about June of this year, is a transition plan to move our fire program to the Forest Stewards Guild, and that's underway now and is going well. And the Nature Conservancy itself will continue to be very much involved in prescribed fire and very much supportive of prescribed fire efforts and collaboration, especially through the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. So we will continue to engage in the work, but as it relates specifically to the on-the-ground component, much of that from here forward will be led by the Forest Stewards Guild. So I wanted to provide that update on our just kind of organizational changes that we've been undergoing for the last couple of months. And then, as I mentioned, secondly, an update on the elk fire review and recommendations. And as I mentioned, the review itself was officially released by the Division of Fire Prevention and Control in March. Interestingly, it was just before everything kind of shut down with the pandemic. We attended the community meeting up in Glacier View, and I believe that was just a week or two really before the shutdown. And that meeting was when the DFPC kind of went through the results in a little bit more detail. And so since that time, we've been going through the review. We of course take it very seriously, and looking at ways in which we can take lessons learned from the review and really, I think, apply it at this point to the larger fire practitioner community. And really 3 themes that emerge from the review that we're focused on are burn planning, this collaborative burn model, and communications and community outreach. And just to provide a little bit more detail on each of these as it relates to burn planning, refinement of fire weather assessments pre-burn, how we work the fire weather into our burn planning process, but also fire weather measurements on site during the actual operational period, and just refinement and improvement in the way in which that information is collected and used in the planning and implementation context. Fire behavior modeling, refinements in how the predictive tools for predicting fire behavior during the operational period can be brought to bear here in the burn planning phase. Implementation windows, so looking at the prescription parameters basically around things like air temperatures, relative humidities, wind speeds, obviously being a really important one in this particular case. And then contingency planning and thinking through how we apply things like fire behavior models outside of the actual burn unit, to better understand if we were to have an escape, what the impacts might look like outside of the burn unit. So those are a few key areas as it relates to burn planning that we've kind of honed in on. And then the collaborative burn model is one that through the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative, we've been working as a collaborative to advance. And this involves a number of agencies and organizations coming together to implement these burns. And we've identified some ways in which we can continue to advance landscape planning efforts, continue to work on training and capacity building for prescribed fire implementation. We paid particular attention through the DFPC review to the organizational structure within the actual burn organization, and looking at things like span of control, where trainees can best plug in, and just kind of a number of factors that go into the overall organizational structure when you bring different agencies, organizations together who haven't often worked closely together on burns in the past. How best do you set those organizations up to carry out a burn? And then related, some improvement in situational awareness among all participants on a burn. So just providing more opportunities for participants to understand the burn unit, have a better feel for things like topography, where the containment lines are located, so that participants on these collaborative burns aren't just showing up to a burn on a given day without having a real good understanding of what the unit itself looks like, what the fuels are like. So really trying to build that situational awareness in much earlier in the process before the actual operational period. And then lastly, on communications and community outreach, improved methods for notifications around burns and opportunities for community engagement. And this, I think, in particular, is where CPRW, the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, is just doing a great job to advance this work through webinars like today and through other outreach opportunities that they have already done and have in the works for or have planned coming up, as Daniel mentioned earlier. So just thinking through how we can involve and engage the communities in these settings, in and around the actual where the activities are taking place themselves, how we can involve those communities and kind of better understanding the purpose of the work, what work is being done, and providing input to how it's being done. So again, those kind of three things that we are moving forward from the recommendations, and in light of the structural changes within TNC, a lot of this will be through the collaborative, the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative Group. And again, I think the recommendations from the review itself apply pretty broadly to the fire practitioner community. So we're very much interested in continuing to advance this learning through the collaborative group, and continuing to learn and grow together and figure out how we do this work effectively and safely into the future. So with that, I will stop and turn it back to you, Daniel. And I think we're close anyway to getting into some questions, right?
Sure are. Thank you very much, Rob. We really
you.
appreciate your input and the way TNC is moving forward with the review process, and really thinking through all the recommendations and how we're moving forward with the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative for future prescribed fire on private lands. This is all incredibly important stuff, and as you and I have talked about, and as almost everybody knows, the fire planning and all the technical stuff is a lot of the process, but the major part is the community engagement and involvement, and those social relationships, community relationships that go into this work. We can't do it without the community behind us. That's exactly right. So, thank you, sir. We have several questions that I've been checking on in the chat box here. And Rob, since you just finished, I might throw one at you real quick and then get to a few from the audience, if that's all right. We had one come in yesterday that I thought was really good, that asked, why was a prescribed fire chosen for management in this area as opposed to other management techniques? As part of the planning of this whole operation, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Daniel, and thank you for the question. I would say, I think first that prescribed fire is one of several tools that have been implemented in this geography. So on the Scout Ranch in particular, the fire itself was preceded, in parts of the unit at least, by mechanical thinning. So there has been some just vegetation fuels reduction that has occurred through both heavy equipment and through sawyer work, and that work certainly continues. And then prescribed fire is often, where possible, brought in combination with those treatments to, as mentioned in the objectives that Kat presented, to further the work of the mechanical work, where prescribed fire is particularly effective in things like management of tree regeneration, creating that more heterogeneous or sort of less uniform forest structure that Wade touched on, surface fuels often, and as a management tool itself is also one that enables us to work at much larger scales for cheaper costs. So there are a lot of advantages to prescribed fire as a management tool, again, in combination with a lot of other tools. But as we know, from this particular fire itself, it's not without risk. And so It's really a matter of trying to think through appropriate time and place for the use of prescribed fire, sort of balanced with the risk as well. And so it's, you know, challenging kind of thinking about that in total at a landscape scale. But again, it is an important tool where we can safely and effectively implement it for advancing these forest restoration, forest management goals.
Great, thank you for that, Rob. I've got several more questions, and I think I'll just take them in order. This one here is for Kat, and asks, it was interesting that the woody fuel loading was not substantially reduced, as you showed in your presentation. Do you know what the 1 and 10-hour fuel moistures were on the day of burning? And do you have any estimates of pre and post burn herbaceous loading?
So I don't have the exact, I don't know if they were collected and dried on the day of burning, I don't believe, but from the fire effects monitor observations, the fine dead woody shaded fuel moisture estimate was 6% is at the lowest on the day of the burn, both burn days. So it seems like it was fairly low. One thing that was mentioned when we were discussing this earlier as to why there wasn't more consumption is potentially if there was a decent breeze, maybe the fire residence time was low and it was just kind of moving through the most available fuel, which might have, you know, been some dry grass and the top layer of litter, and not really stayed back to consume the woody fuels.
Great, thank you. And a related question, Kat. Also got one asking, was there an objective to minimize an increase in noxious weeds? And, you know, do you guys survey for invasive species, noxious weeds, and what can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I mean, the specific objective as written is actually more focused on increasing natives, but obviously everyone involved, I think, was concerned about cheatgrass because that tends to do very well with fire. So we measured cheatgrass at all of the plots, all 39 of them. Usually we wouldn't do that as part of our simple plot protocol, but since there was such concern over that with fire, we you know, measuring it immediately post fire wouldn't really make sense because it would just burned up. But we did just go back and in June and July recollected that data, so we will be analyzing that as well. I don't believe there are any other, there's some thistles, but maybe, I'm not sure if there's any other invasives of concern in that area. We definitely make a note though whenever we find noxious weeds around. And in the mothership plots, we do a complete species survey, so we can do native, invasive, and noxious.
Oh, nice. So, yeah, so you will have all that information comprehensively. Yeah. And I know from being out there, you're right, the cheatgrass is a concern, and there are thistle here and there. I know that the Scout Ranch actively treats those infestations as they come up. Yeah. Thank you. We did have one for Wade. This asks, the structures from motion imagery refers to the data points, but could you explain again what defines a data point? Is it tree height, density of foliage, or what?
Yeah, so the structure from motion is the images are looking at the same location from multiple angles. And so generally the algorithms work best whenever we get at least 4 to 8 images that see the same location. So in these acquisitions, I want to say we had 1,600 images in each acquisition roughly. So it's a lot of images that we're processing through. And so at any location, there's a chance for up to like 80 images to see that location at different view angles. So then it basically just creates an elevation location of where the pixel co-aligns. And so it's whatever it's hitting at that location, be it the tree stem, a group of needles, the very top of the tree, whatever it is. And then we process that to interpret the vegetation elevation itself after we do some filtering to relativize it to the ground. And so we assign a direct height to each of those points that get generated. And so they're just points in 3-dimensional space that we're then trying to analyze and figure out what they belong to. And so we use some of those other algorithms to assign them to an individual tree.
Great, thank you. And a follow-up to that, somebody asked if tree response is evaluated by species. I didn't know if it was broken out by species or not.
We have the ability to, we just haven't taken the time to go through the pre-fire data and basically train it based on the different spectral indices for the species. It should be fairly straightforward for us to break it out by the different species. Clearly, a lot of that high severity is in those young aspen within the site that were already in the process of dropping leaves at the same time as the fire coming through. So they happened to not look very green post-fire because there was no leaves left on any of them. So that does account for some of the high severity component that's out in the landscape. But we just haven't had the time, but the data has the ability to separate out by species.
Great, thank you very much. This one might be best for Rob, kind of from that management perspective. As far as forest management goes at the Scout Ranch, how can they coordinate their management activities, which is very active management of the forest base there, with the research so that these long-term plots and things like that are able to continue over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Carl. And one of the benefits of this project overall is that it does have a lot of data accompanying it really for a number of years now. And the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, a whole range of other volunteers, other organizations that have been involved in the data collection, all that's been just super important to understanding not only the effects of this burn, but the effects of these other management treatments as well, some of the mechanical work that I mentioned earlier. And this is one of the few areas, to my knowledge, really, where we have data that accompanies various management actions, kind of the full forest management, forest restoration process. And so it's unique in that sense. So it is a good question about how we kind of retain this knowledge and the plots themselves on the ground. And I think, in my mind, it would be, it could be a good topic for us actually, Daniel, to touch on within the Elkhorn Creek Forest Health Initiative to kind of come up with a plan for, thinking through how we retain control plots so that we have those on the landscape to measure against when we're doing actual treatments. And that was, of course, one issue that we ran into with this burn, is that we had control plots used for previous treatments that were within the burn unit that we then, kind of modified to become treatment plots. And so just, thinking through that bigger picture about how we set up the science, set up the actual data collection on the ground to continue to provide us this long-term information is a good point to raise, and I think something that would be good for us to take up with a little more detail and in a way that's a little more deliberate.
Agreed. And it's a good place to thank the Scout Ranch again for their help and their willingness to be part of this active management and this research. They've been excellent partners, and we look forward to continuing the work out there. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great place to work. Thanks to Bob Sturdivant and the folks at the Scout Ranch for letting us work up there. It's really kind of a welcome change from working in some other places.
Absolutely. All right, let's see, moving on. We have several more excellent questions. There was one that asked, what analysis did any of you do on the area where the prescribed burn escaped? And what do we know about the impact of fire on those pieces of land that were outside the burn perimeter? Do you want to take these in order? I don't know, Kat, Wade, we probably don't have a lot of plot information.
Yeah, none.
Right, on those other private properties. Chuck, do you want to speak to that? I know there's a sampling point slightly downstream from some of that escape area.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately we're looking for places with water. So if there wasn't water on the place that escaped, we didn't do much. But yeah, Daniel's correct. We sampled downstream a ways, and I showed you what we've got collected. And we're probably not going to sample a lot farther down because we're not seeing anything right at the closest points. So we didn't really get up into that area on the other side of the bank. We actually thought initially, before we were out with people that had been involved in the operations, that riparian area was part of the escape, being ignorant to the layout and all the specifics. And then we learned later on that was an intentional part of it that was used as a fire break. And luckily we were able to inform ourselves about that, but we actually didn't cross out into the escape at all.
Right, thank you. And I do know, just on a personal note, one of the 4 private properties that was directly affected by the escaped fire, I've worked closely with one of the landowners on doing an assessment of burn severity on some of the canopy trees on that property and thinking through what the possibilities are there for helping with some management and getting some of those dead trees taken care of. Let's see, next, what are the long-term effects of fire retardant on the land, trees, and water for the prescribed burn and the escape area land? Maybe that's a good one for Chuck. Do you know much about chemistry of the fire retardant and what we might see downstream?
Yeah, there can be nutrients in fire retardant, and if that gets directly in the stream, there's sometimes they'll put seed down, sometimes they'll put down nutrients to try to speed recovery. So keeping it out of the stream is important. You know, there's usually, it's such a short term and sparse and small footprint effect that it's not something that's probably a large concern unless it's been sprayed directly over a stream channel. In this fire, we didn't analyze that, and we didn't actually see signs of it on the ground that were in areas where we thought it would be worth checking out.
Great, thank you, Chuck. Next, this one's about costs. Rob spoke to this just a little bit. How much does prescribed fire and wildfire cost? You know, a relative assessment of costs there. And is anything being learned regarding scaling prescribed fires to be more cost effective? Is that something you could speak to a minute, Rob?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Jim. Good seeing you on here, by the way. Let's see, for this particular burn, I believe the cost per acre estimate for the prescribed fire component was around $250 an acre. I may need to double check that, but that's typically roughly the cost per acre that we're operating at for prescribed burns, which is quite a, significantly cheaper than mechanical and sawyer work. In some cases by about an order of magnitude. So we can pay as much as, $2,000 to $3,000 per acre for the mechanical component. So as you mentioned in your question, and as I touched on just briefly earlier, prescribed fire as management tool does provide that advantage, again, where you can safely and effectively implement. It is much cheaper to implement relative to other types of treatments. So it does have that advantage, and also has the advantage, as you mentioned in your question, about scale and being able to do larger areas with prescribed fire. As it relates to this particular burn, of course, it was with the wildfire and the wildfire response built in. It would have been much more than the $250 per acre if we factored that in, and that's not an analysis that we've done at this point, but would be good to kind of build in, I think, as we continue to better understand the costs associated with the escape portion and the wildfire response itself.
Great information. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks.
We've got a couple minutes left, and I've still got a few questions, so I'll keep going with these. I think these are great questions, and we're getting some really good information here. Maybe for Kat, for the ground cover, how long will it take for the land to recover from the moderate and high severity areas?
We didn't really see any high severity areas, at least as measured by the substrate. There were some areas where, the canopy cover was removed or whatnot. So it's hard to say. I think, especially in moderate areas, those needles that were killed that turned red will fall, and the ground cover should, be mostly back to normal within roughly a year or so. But some high severity areas, we take our field crews out to the Haven fire every year, except this one. And when you walk out there, you'll see it's still not recovered. It's a lot of bare ground and soil still, and bunch grasses, and no trees in the middle. So I think it can take a long time for especially those really large high severity areas, which we don't tend to see in prescribed fires, although the Forest Service actually has been doing some burning up at Red Feather Lakes, and they did some July burning last year and got fairly large patch, I think of 25 acres of high severity fire effects. So we have monitoring plots in there too. So we are still tracking this. And yeah, I really am, I think it's great so many people are attending and are interested in this sort of thing. I look forward to learning more and then sharing it with you all too, as we find out.
I think if I could add a quick point, I think the high severity areas that we sort of targeted for our sampling were in areas that were dominated by aspen and other shrubs that tend to resprout very vigorously. Wildfire's a natural process in those fuel types. They can respond quickly to it. And so those areas that had high fuels and burned hot will probably recover fairly well. I would guess. We need to go out there and look at it, but I bet those aspen are sprouting and coming back well.
Great, thank you all. And I think we've had a couple questions about data availability. So if you don't mind, just the three of you, Rob too, if you wanted to add anything from TNC's perspective. The data that you guys have presented today, how can the public get a hold of these data sets and or publications with these data? I
can start on that real quickly. CPRW is planning to host the water quality data from the Citizen Science Monitoring Network, and so that should be available within a year, I believe. And in the meantime, if anybody has specific needs for it and interest, they could contact me or Hallie Strevey, my contact at CPRW, and we'd be glad to share what's available and what sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Chuck said. I mean, our data is not currently intended to be hosted anywhere, but I'm more than happy to share it with anybody that wants to reach out with us. It is a rather large amount of data with like 8,000 photos and such being collected. So it's close to a terabyte, I believe. And so anybody that wants a terabyte of data can contact me. We can figure that out.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Wade there. Just, email me and we'll see what we can do. No publications as of yet, however, very interested. I think that prescribed fire is having different effects on trees in general in Colorado than a lot of the publications will tell you out of California or Oregon. So I'm definitely interested in gathering up all the information we have on that and making it, submitting it through the peer review process, getting a publication out.
Yeah, and I would just add that data and results for work done really dating back to about 2015. Some of that is available on the Peaks to People webpage, and then Daniel, it'd be good to think through as well from CPRW's webpage and potentially through the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative, just beginning to try to have some type of repository for these reports and results and data and everything else that's coming out of not only this burn but other burns that are being monitored in the Red Feather Lakes area through the work that the U.S. Forest Service is doing, and kind of having some area where a lot of this information would be accessible. I think that'd be a good thing to look into a little more.
Absolutely, I agree. We're about 3 minutes over. There's still a few good questions. I think we'll just have to call it here though and let people get on to the rest of their day. But I want to thank our panelists for really excellent presentations here. I want to thank Ian Sharkey, who has really helped with the technicalities of getting Zoom working for all of us over the past several months, and all my colleagues at CPRW and all the community members and everyone else who tuned in today. This was a really excellent continuation of the conversation about the Elkhorn Unit 4 burn. We have lots left to talk about. This was about science and monitoring the ecological effects of what actually happened out on the ground. And hopefully we have a better understanding of that now. And that will help to inform our upcoming conversations on those community effects and moving forward with prescribed fire in this landscape. So thank you everyone very much. I hope you have a pleasant rest of your day, and you'll see more from us soon. Thanks.
Thank you all.